My name is Kevin Averick. I am the Dean of the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, and on behalf of the school I want to welcome all of you here tonight. This is a topic that is of utmost importance to all of us and everyone on the planet. It is a topic that has been a special concern and a special focus for us at the school for many, many years. And we have some individuals here connected with the topic who even predate Richard O'Brien's recent arrival. We have Dr. Gregory Stanton, who is the founder of Genocide Watch. We have Professor Daniel Rothbard, who's done work on Darfur. We have Tetsushi, who is the executive director of the Center for Genocide Prevention, which was founded under my predecessor's dean, Andrea Bartoli. We're especially happy to welcome Richard O'Brien to us as a visiting scholar. As many of you know, Richard was the director of the Center for the Prevention of Genocide between 2002 and 2004, and joined us as a visiting scholar at ESCAR. One of the things that characterizes our school is that we are not only a collection of researchers and professors engaged in educating at the baccalaureate level, at the master's level, and PhD level. We were, in fact, the first institution of higher learning in the world to give a master's degree in conflict resolution in 1981, and the first in the world to give a PhD degree in 1988. Besides the usual things that professors do, we were from the very beginning committed to the notion of work in the world. And we were committed to the notion that our research and our scholarship and our education would be directed towards making a difference in conflict-saturated places and for people who are the most direct victims of conflict, and perhaps the worst sort of conflict, that is genocidal conflict. So it was with that in mind that when Richard came to us several months ago and wanted to reestablish the work that he had been doing at the earlier center and sit himself down in a university setting, in a vibrant community of students and scholars and researchers, and in a place where, as I said, much work on genocide and genocide prevention was already going on, we were happy to welcome him. And it's in that spirit that I want to welcome you again, Richard, and welcome this opportunity to have your work here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean Averick. First of all, before we get going, I am Richard O'Brien. I'm your host and your presenter. I say host because whenever there's food around, I think somebody's hosting. So make sure to eat as much as you can and take food with you. We're going to have some introductions before we get started today. I wanted to thank a few people for coming here. Some of the board members that sat on the Center for the Prevention of Genocide's board are here tonight. I would like to acknowledge them. The first person I wanted to acknowledge, who has to leave very shortly, he's in between things, is John Heidmerich. John Heidmerich is the author of How to Prevent Genocide, and in the first story I'll be telling tonight, he's the person that I wake up repeatedly next to his wife saying, who's calling at 2:30 in the morning regarding the massacres in Sulawesi that we're going to talk about. Kai Dialton-Popialik also sat on our board of directors, giving us just great advice and a good business sense as to how to keep it up for the scant 4 years that it was open. And I'd also like to acknowledge Gregory Stanton, who did not sit on our board, but Gregory runs Genocide Watch. He founded it the year before we founded the center, which was, he founded his in 1999. We were founded in 2000. And, you know, if there's ever a place where you've heard of, you know, an obscure place like Equatorial Guinea, and you wonder if a genocide happened, go to Genocide Watch, you'll know. And he's probably printed, you know, more reports on it than anyone else. And I'm always amazed at the activities he's done in the field for how long he's been in the field, and it's an honor to have Greg Stanton as well. Lastly, I wanted to acknowledge Felix Galbus-Reege, and he hates this when I do this, but Felix single-handedly saved the center in our first year when we were on a luge going out of business, and he he put together a strategy that kept us in business. Later on, we'll be joined by the ambassador of Kosovo, Ambassador Ismaili, and I'll introduce him when he comes. So just for a brief moment, I think their work is deserving of applause. If John Heidmerk would stand, and please, John, Felix, Kai, and Gregory Stanley. Thank you very much. So our subject tonight is a very serious subject matter. It's, I believe, the subject matter that deserves the most attention and often gets the least. For 12 of the past 16 years, I've either been writing about it, researching it, or running an early warning system on genocide and genocide prevention. Tonight you're going to hear a few heart-rending stories, and you're also going to hear heroic stories about heroes like Raoul Wallenberg and Andre Trocmé and the better-known Oskar Schindler. Tonight is about genocide, but it's not only about genocide. It's about hope. And it's important to know that some people believe certain things. I know that genocide can be eradicated in a generation. I know that we can do early warning, rapid response, and put together strategies that we're going to discuss in the last portion of this presentation that can end genocide from human annals. But the problem is the political will, so we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. The three parts that we're going to discuss this evening, the first part is genocide over 100 years and how you compact 100 years of genocide into an hour, let alone an hour and a half, usually takes a semester or two. So we're going to touch on highlights and key figures and lessons to be learned. The second thing is to discuss a little bit about the Center for the Prevention of Genocide, which was opened from 2000 to 2004. And that's part of the hope. As Greg knows, that early warning can be done on a shoestring budget. The average age of the volunteers and staff at the Center for the Prevention of Genocide was 24. The two volunteers, Joanna and Yevgeny, who blew the whistle on a man-induced famine that was occurring in Nuba in the off-season in 2002, were 19 and 20 years of age. The point is, when you leave here, hopefully this clarion call to arms does not end with your saying, well, okay, that was an interesting lecture. Many of you are already conflict prevention practitioners, but the hope is that we take a lesson that this is preventable and that it's in each of our hands to do a little something about it. There was a young girl in 6th grade who put together the first relief flight out of western Florida to arrive less than a week after the earthquake in Haiti in January of 2010. She went to Outdoor Academy. Now, it helped that her father had a jet. However, she was in 6th grade and she put that together. So anytime you think you can't make a significant, not just researching difference, but a practical difference, think of that 6th grader. The cover which I've featured, or the proposed cover that I've featured for the upcoming book, Genocide, The Most Dangerous Century, it's a 100-year retrospective of genocide, has victims of genocide on it. Some have survived, many have not. And I picked that because of something that, if you saw Hotel Rwanda, and you remember the scene where the hotel manager, Paul Rusesabagina, was talking to his staff, and he says, reach through, when you're talking to people on the phone, reach through the line as if the people on the other end are holding your hand. Because you want them to feel that if they let go, you may die. The people that are in those photographs that are looking at you and looking at policymakers and looking at people that read the book, they deserve that we not only pay attention to genocide and genocide prevention when something bad is happening. An overarching theme that we're going to have tonight is that when it's time for heroism, when it's time for the Raoul Wallenbergs and the Trocmés and the Schindlers of the world, that's too late. When it's time for heroism, the world community, that's including you and I, have failed to do anything. Now, when people are being massacred, or I'm sorry, when people are being threatened in a little town in the middle of nowhere and there is no strategic interest, really the best thing to do is to flee, is to get out. Because usually the cavalry is not coming. Usually the world community does not care. Now that can change with better early warning, with a commitment for rapid response, and political will, and that's where we come in. We're going to be talking about the U.S. Holocaust Museum's blueprint for genocide prevention a little bit later on, and part of that blueprint is building a national and international coalition of individuals who are willing to get involved, personally and politically. So, has Ambassador Ismaili arrived? Ambassador Ismaili, please stand and be recognized. The Ambassador from Kosovo, Ambassador Ismaili, thank you for joining us this evening. So, I'm half Armenian. I'm Irish, Italian, Armenian, American, and I'm a mutt. But I always wondered when I was a kid how anyone could kill my ancestors. Every Armenian that I knew was funny or a good cook or, I don't know, just interesting. And I didn't get that. And I couldn't understand how the world community could stand by while that was happening. I grew up hearing the stories from great-grandma's daughter, my grandmother, about Topal Serpik and how she had to climb a staircase of heads that she put together because she was starving in the Zia al-Zor desert and reached for fruit in the tree, and how she slipped, and how her primary memory of childhood was swimming in a sea of heads, and how Jadu's, my great-grandfather, was chopped up in front of my great-grandmother. And reading how in Edgarian's book, Rise of Euphrates, how the troops used to line up the Armenian women with long hair and would play this game where they would tie their hair to a low-hanging branch and see how many heads they could sever at one blow. As awful as those stories were, it occurred to me why nothing happened years later. In 1994, when the Rwandan genocide occurred, I looked at the newspaper just like everybody else did and said, what a shame this was. It was probably on page 12 because O.J. Simpson was in the news on the cover. And then I clucked my tongue and I went on and looked at the rest of the newspaper. It was 3 years later in '97 when I began writing my master's thesis at Georgetown that I realized that that was it. That little subtle thing that happened there. I'm Irish, Italian, Armenian, my mother's Canadian. If any of those subsets were being massacred, I would have stood on the street corner, I would have gone to Congress, I would have raised a bell, that clarion call of warning, right? But because the people were not of my nationality, by the same token, when people are not of your religion, your ethnicity, your nationality, even your race, nationalism plays a role here, and it's vital. Now, on one hand, nationalism is important, not just for the Olympics that you cheer the loudest for your national team, and not just as a great economic building block, but nationalism is important for self-identification reasons. I am these things. Now, we all know the dangers of overt nationalism, total warfare, genocide. But the subtle secondary dangers of nationalism is what I studied for my master's thesis, and I called it genocidal indifference. Now, the subtle secondary danger is crucial here. It's that as we are all bound together by the same religion or ethnicity or nationality or race, that, you know, with a smaller group of people that we feel more comfortable with or identify with, it also allows us to assign a lesser station of humanity to everybody else. That's a danger. And it's tough to put that in a little capsule and for people to get that, but if you get that danger, you know why. Genocide will always exist in human affairs until we make a system, create a system to anticipate it. Just like the Founding Fathers of the United States said, oh, well, you know, mankind is vile and mean and sordid as well as he is beautiful and graceful. Well, you have to plan for those negative things. So you create a constitution that has checks and balances and division of powers. So too do you have to, at the international level, have an early warning system that truly can predict it and truly respond rapidly to get in the way of the killing of innocents. Now, when we turn to each other, this is an exercise I would do with my human rights classes over 4 years. We would introduce ourselves to each other, and then we'd start talking about ethics. And we'd start with a low-ball question. The low-ball question would be, if a baby was in the street and traffic was coming, would you intervene? And of course, everybody puts up their hand, yes, of course I would intervene. If the traffic was close, would you intervene? Well, most hands would go up. If it's likely you would get hurt by one of the cars but save the baby, would you? Then you start to thin the herd. There is a famous analogy of a child caught in a lake. And I think this analogy is particularly appropriate with us today. If your child is caught in a lake and their foot is caught, they're not drowning, but something's happening and they're stuck. and you happen to call at that moment, and a stranger in an expensive suit is walking by quickly, and they pick up the phone, and they say, oh yeah, I see the kid. Well, yeah, they're struggling a little bit, but I'm sure somebody else will be along in a second. What in a world of words can you say to that person that's in too much of a hurry to take off their expensive suit, get in there and save your child? Now imagine that that person is a continent or half a globe away. This is the frustration that nations all over the world have faced time and time again for over 100 years when dealing with the indifference of the rest of the planet. How do you convince you and I? Many of us are never going to see genocide. How do you convince us that that person that you just met is sitting on the other side of the world somewhere, and it's going to happen to them? And the only way we can prevent it is to start making arrangements now. I mentioned before that when the time for heroism is at hand, it's too late. So before we get to the acts of genocide that we're going to talk about today, what are some of the possibilities for intervention? Well, the Center for the Prevention of Genocide was one, and I'll tell you a few stories. Greg's organization is another. ESCAR, the dean, very humbly told you a little bit about ESCAR. We need to do so much more to get word out about ESCAR. I'm walking the halls of ESCAR, and one department alone, it's the Department of, let's see if I can find it, the Center for World Religions, Diplomacy, and Conflict Resolution. They're working on Israel-Palestinian public citizens training workshops and educational efforts. Another department in that school is working, it's the Center for Peacemaking Practice. They've got dialogues going on between the Armenians and the Azeris in Nagorno-Karabakh in Tiflis. They've also got talks going on between Georgia and Southern Ossetia. There's a 24-year-old in that department who, for the past 4 years, before she started pursuing her master's here, was doing conflict mediation for families that had had violence in the Brooklyn court system in New York City. These practitioners go into gang layers, into militia headquarters, into the roughest places in the world. We got a young man named Tatsushi today give a lecture about how he is going to the Karen and the Shen areas in Burma, in Myanmar, and trying to put into place a Buddhist-centered conflict resolution system. Thank you, John. The stories are amazing. The Institute for Multi-Track Diplomacy, the U.S. Holocaust Museum's blueprint for how to prevent genocide. These are tangible places that have the answer. Don't have enough funding and don't have enough people that know that they're there yet. So we'll be talking about that a little bit later on. So in 1994, when Rwanda was exploding, were there telltale signs beforehand? Absolutely. In 1994, the results that occurred in 1994 were the end of a long process leading to this genocide, beginning with the colonialism that separated the Tutsis and the Hutus and pit them against each other. The Burundi massacres in 72 and 88 cannot be overlooked. These are when the Hutus were victimized by the military in Burundi. So when 94 occurred, Habyarimana, the president of Rwanda, was in a bit of a bind. He had preached this anti-Tutsi rhetoric for so long that now that he had signed the Arusha Accords and the Hutu militias were saying, well, we're never going to accept it, once he was assassinated, the genocide began. And it was a well-planned genocide. But this is not Zyklon B on the final solution. This is not by machine gun. This is by machete. 800,000 perished in 100 days by machete in Rwanda. Now, there are a number of lessons to take. First of all, let's look at the UN. The United Nations had 2,000 troops on the ground. They knew the genocide was going to come down because General Dallaire reported to his supervisor, unfortunately it was Kofi Annan, and the response that came back to him was turn in that informant to the government. And when the massacre began, those 2,000 troops that could have done something with a rewriting of their mandate was reduced to 200. The African Union wanted to go in, but in a monumental obfuscation, the United States failed to call what happened in Rwanda genocide, and then bickered with the UN over whether we would give them the armored personnel carriers which were sitting on an airport runway in Stuttgart over the payment for it and whether the United States was behind on its dues and whatnot. So the United States dropped the ball. The UN dropped the ball. Even the French, who in Operation Turquoise ended up with boots on the ground, first of all, were supplying the Hutu militias until the moment they arrived, and second of all, could not get to the areas where people were being massacred. Ultimately, the Rwandan Patriotic Front defeated the Hutu militias and what was left of the FAR government and chased them to DR Congo. Not the end of the story. 39,000 Tutsis are massacred there. We have a young man who happens to be Hutu, walked 3,700 kilometers. He was 13 years old to go to safety because of the trouble. And time again, you hear the stories come down. Now, some of the good things, the silver lining here is that after this horror show was over, the Gakaka courts, similar to the Truth and Reconciliation courts of South Africa, really gave a glimmer of how to rebuild after that kind of a disaster occurs. But like we see time and time again, people probably at the end are going to ask about Syria. The answer for Syria was the same thing with Rwanda, is before it ever starts. Intervene when you see the signs. But we're not wired that way. We're wired for reaction. Going back in history, after the Armenian genocide ended from 1915 to 1918, which was the one that I told you about my family history, in 1932, there was the Holodomor in Ukraine. 5 to 6 million people were intentionally starved to death by the Soviet Union government led by Joseph Stalin. Why haven't I heard of this? Why is this news to me? Well, there are a number of reasons, but part of the reason is when you don't have a free press, when it's a remote location, those stories often don't get out. Now, Joseph Stalin was worried about an independence movement that seemed to be awakening in the Ukraine. He was converting the major farms over to Soviets, collectivizing the farms, and the kulaks are very strong in Ukraine. So he took a page out of our history books, and I'm not comparing Joseph Stalin with Rutherford B. Hayes, but what did Rutherford B. Hayes do to defeat the Sioux Confederacy? He didn't send troops. He sent independent contractors to kill every buffalo on the plain. And the Sioux Confederacy starved, and that's how they surrendered. Time and time again, the Igbo in Nigeria were starved. The North Koreans in 2002 and earlier had a man-exacerbated famine where the regime took the aid and simply kept it for their party members. The Nuba mountain range, we're going to hear about that. That's happened several times, where the Darfurian government has time and time again used starvation. Al-Shabaab, a year and a half ago, took the area that it controlled and refused to allow aid to get in, allowing for famine conditions. So we see time and time again that what happened in Armenia happens again, time and time again. What happened in Ukraine happens time and time again because we didn't put into place those international sanctions, those biting with teeth laws that will help prevent these things from occurring. 1934 to 1945, we all know that the Holocaust occurred. When we were trying to get the Center for the Prevention of Genocide off the ground, Kyle probably remember this, we had Charlene Schiff, a Holocaust survivor, come, and Eddie Touré, he survived the massacres in Sierra Leone. And when they finished speaking, there's no question that we were going to do the mission that we set out for, even though we didn't have any money or any experts except for John Heidrich, who just left. Charlene Schiff told about how she was in the Warsaw Ghetto with her family, and that how her mother and she found a crack in the wall and decided that if anything happened, they would both go through the crack and hide. And so when they heard the first shots ring out in the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto, that's where they went. And they made it to the outside. And they laid low for several hours. And then Charlene Schiff's mom said, "I'm just going to go back to see if your sister made it to one of the other hiding spots." And for the rest of her life, Charlene regretted not begging her mom to wait longer because she never came back. And so Charlene would go to the outskirts of towns and would rummage for food among the trash, and that's how she survived. And then eventually she met up with a group of about a dozen other children who were survivors of the liquidation of the ghetto. And they only stayed together for a few days. That turned out to be the rest of their lives. Because one of those mornings, a young villager child saw these children rummaging for food and alarmed the village. The village came out with pitchforks and they hid in these huge barrels of hay. And so they pitchforked the barrels until all of them were dead, save Charlene. So when she sat down, we had our mission. In 1942, a group of nearly 20 SS officers and other members, high-ranking members of the Third Reich, met in a villa in Wannsee. This is the Wannsee Conference. And in this conference, they decided the final solution as pictured by Adolf Hitler, as passed down to them through Himmler to Reinhard Heydrich. The execution was to be Adolf Eichmann. And the final solution they foresaw was not the piecemeal approach that they had been doing thus far, gassing Jews in vans, small-scale massacres, and the like. They had tried on mental patients a gassing technique. And so they had decided that they were going to industrialize the final solution at Auschwitz and other places so that they would kill the rest of the Jewish population in Europe by gas. This final solution, of the 20 or so SS members and high-ranking Nazis that were there, almost a dozen of them lived till their old age. There was no punishment for many of them, or small punishment. While this is happening, 3 individuals were about their business. One individual you're probably familiar with. His name is Oskar Schindler. Now, many of us have seen Schindler's List, outstanding movie. I'm here not to praise Schindler. I'm not here to bury him either, but when Schindler, the most important lesson of Schindler is not that he saved 1,200 Jews. Yes, this is clearly one of the most important. But the most important lesson of Schindler is the transformation of character. I don't know how many of you know Breaking Bad. Life is about transformation, right? And of course that character in Breaking Bad transforms from good to bad. Well, here it is. Oskar Schindler was bad. Not just being a playboy and cheating on his wife, but this man was using slave labor. He was borrowing from Jews under duress to finance his factory. This is not the poster child for a hero. What happened to this friend of monsters that eventually he started giving a watch here, giving a piece of jewelry there to save this one or to transfer that one, and ultimately led to him paying a vast amount of his wealth to essentially ransom his 1,200 Jews. What transformed that? The human spirit is a complex thing, but it's important to know that this is part of the solution, the convincing, the transformation. This is the only man who had access to these monsters at the level that could have allowed these people to be purchased. André Trocmé, the pastor from Le Chambon, he refused to salute the Nazi flag one morning, the Vichy flag. And from that simple refusal, absolute refusal to salute it, the whole town was abuzz. Soon, other people started taking little acts of sabotage. When the first Jewish orphans arrived in Le Chambon, he put them up in his house. And then his barn when there were more. And then he went to parishioners and says, we're up to our elbows in Jewish orphans. Can you take a few? And they did. And before you knew it, the vast majority of Le Chambon was complicit in hiding the Jews. 3,000 to 5,000 Jewish orphans and sometimes their family survived, beginning with him refusing to salute the Nazi flag. In fact, when the Vichy government sent a delegation there, a young man, 17 years of age, stood up, gave them a letter, and the letter essentially says, we're aware of what happened at Veldiv in Paris, and if you ask us for our Jews that are hiding among us, we see no difference between themselves and ourselves. We will not give them up. They could have put a bullet in the back of his head right there. Instead, the conversation on the way home among those Vichy was, what should we do? France hadn't been conquered by Germany in quite some time, if ever. Maybe my history is a little weak there. What is the template? Are we supposed to collaborate? Are we supposed to say, that's where the Jews are? Are we supposed to be indifferent and just wash our hands of it? Or should we do something to throw a sabbat, a shoe, in the works? And so every time they were going to raid the compound in the city of Le Chambon, a telephone call would come from the gendarmerie. An officer would simply dial Trocmé's number, put it down, and walk away. That's not indifference. That simple act is heroism. My favorite person saved for my family on the planet in the 20th century was Wallenberg. Wallenberg is the Guinness Book of World Records holder for the most lives that he's saved. For those of you who may not be familiar with Raoul Wallenberg, he was from the Wallenberg banking family in Switzerland, kind of like the Rockefellers of Switzerland. Wallenberg had this very broad education. University of Michigan State? University of Michigan, one of the two. He stayed in Haifa, where he stayed in a kosher house. He traveled through Nazi-occupied Germany on family business. So he saw firsthand what was happening. In 1942, he saw a movie with his half-sister. Half-sister's still alive, Nina. And at the end of the movie, The Scarlet Pimpernel, take off on it, it's a movie about a man who saves Jews from concentration camps. He looks at his sister, he says, that's what I want to do. 2 years later, he pulls up in a car in Budapest outside of the Swedish embassy, the Swedish legation, and he takes a special position attached to the Swedish embassy. His mission is to save as many Jews from annihilation. Almost 400,000 Jews had already been victimized in Hungary. Budapest was one of the last holdouts. There are at least 250,000 Jews left in the country, and it was one of the last places where the Third Reich was clearly putting its attention. What did he do? He looked around, he said, okay, we're going to create a fake passport, a travel pass for fake travel to Sweden. It's not going to really, nobody's going to take a trip to Sweden with this passport, but what it does is if we give it to somebody, and we're going to give it to the Jews that are about to be annihilated, it will protect them under the Swedish diplomatic protection. We're saying they're waiting for the war to end, for better circumstances, to go to Sweden. He puts huge billboards, he's rich, puts huge billboards around the city. Look for the Schutzpass. The soldiers, they don't know better, okay? He goes, between browbeating and bribing officials in the government, he gets it to be legitimate. He gets a quota, 800, 1,200, 2,500, up to 4,000. After he reaches the maximum, he cannot get them to make any more of these. Oh, and by the way, what does he do with them? They're lining up Jews at the river. They're about to shoot them, and a car pulls up with a truck behind it. Raoul Wallenberg jumps out. Says, excuse me, hold on, those are some Schutzpass holders, I recognize some, and his aide goes among their number and says, put your hand up when he says so. He says, how many of you are Schutzpass holders? No, come on, put your hand up. And one guy says, oh, I thought so. Where's your pass? I left it at home. Okay, here's a temporary pass. How about by the end of that, everybody puts their hand up. Everybody gets into the van. Women being marched to the trains. He comes into the barn, takes down their name, furiously goes back to the embassy, produces it, meets them at the next town, and rescues them time and time again. When they can't do anything else with the Schutzpass, he rents apartment complexes, plants a Swedish flag and calls it diplomatic territory, puts Jewish families in there. Thus begins the international ghetto. There's the Red Cross, several other countries follow suit, Switzerland and others. My favorite story about Raoul Wallenberg is the last night of the Arrow Cross government. The Horthy government was the regime that was in power. They were overthrown in the last 6 weeks of the war. And this really, when you think of fascists, this is like the skinhead fascists of the Hungarian fascists at the time. And the Arrow Cross, well, the first thing they did was they took the Schutzpass and they said, this is no good anymore. It just so happened that the Minister of the Interior's wife was a close friend of Raoul Wallenberg's. And he knew she was Jewish. So he said to her, go to your husband, tell him that he's got to reinstate the pass. She goes, but he can't. If he does that, then he says, well, he says, it's the only way to save your baby because, you know. And she eventually goes to her husband, and the husband changes his mind when he realizes that Raul could turn him in. That act saved lives. But my favorite is on the very last night, the order comes down to liquidate the ghetto. And the SS Führer is pacing in his hotel room. He's not sure what to do. And an envelope comes from Raoul Wallenberg. There's a price on Raoul's head, so he's not going there in person. It says, I'm aware of the decision you have to make. While he's waiting, there's 200 SS officers, 800 Arrow Cross officers ready to massacre the ghetto with 60,000 Jews in it. He says, let me assure you that I personally will stand at your crimes against humanity trial if you go ahead with it. Angrily, he throws down the note, picks up the phone, and cancels the order. To me, that's 60,000 lives. Now, Raoul was captured by the Soviets at the end of the war. It is believed that he may have lived until the 1980s in a Soviet gulag. He may have perished earlier. There's a famous, often repeated story of a guy that saw him, one of the last sightings of him, coming out of this in a solitary confinement. Only one person could be in the courtyard in this far eastern Siberian camp. And as he came out of the elevator and the other guy was going in, Wallenberg, with a half smile on his face, put up his hand and said, taxi. As he started, he was just, the point is, I think that he must have been content with the knowledge of the nearly 100,000 lives that he saved. I'm going to read you something. I don't know if I have time to read the whole thing, but I'll do the best I can. This has been printed 3 other times, reprinted 3 other times, and there are 2 original first-hand sources that wrote about this in their memoirs. I have done nothing to this except for edit what's already there. Not one word of this is mine, so I don't take credit for any of this. What this is I am simply calling it something that nobody else has called it. Adolf Eichmann was in Budapest, went to a dinner party thrown by Raoul Wallenberg. At the end of the dinner party, the man that is synonymous with evil and the man that is synonymous with good went to have brandy in a small room, and they proceeded to debate Nazism and the Holocaust. To me, the Wallenberg-Eichmann debate is good versus evil. Eichmann was curious about this mysterious Swede, and in mid-December he accepted an invitation for dinner from Wallenberg. Preoccupied with the day's activity, Raoul had forgotten about his guest and enlisted the help of Lars Berg, his colleague at the Swedish embassy. Within a few hours, Berg had organized a sumptuous meal served on the finest china. The dinner had proved a success, and afterward the group retired to the living room where coffee and brandy were served. On the horizon, Russian guns sounded a distant thunder. Wallenberg was careful to face Eichmann and Krumi, his associate, so that they were facing the curtains that were covering an east-facing window. Eichmann sat in an overstuffed armchair, brandy snifter in hand. Then Wallenberg told Carlson to open the curtains. Carlson did so as Wallenberg turned the lights out. A fierce Soviet barrage lit the horizon to the east with explosives. Gode Carlson, one of the guests at the dinner party, was startled by the effect of the silhouettes as they were lit up by crackling gunfire. The effect was tremendous, Carlson recalled. The horizon was bright red from the fire of 1,000 Russian guns. Wallenberg stood at the window as Eichmann sat in his armchair, quaffing the brandy. He began to engage Eichmann in a conversation about National Socialism and the likely outcome of war. It's not really a bona fide ideology, said Wallenberg. It's just the political incarnation of a basic, single basic human emotion, hatred. How long can it last? Eichmann then tried to defend National Socialism, spewing poisonous catchphrases about the Jewish Bolshevik menace and world Jewish conspiracy. Fearlessly and brilliantly, Wallenberg picked Nazi doctrine apart piece by piece and foretold of its total defeat of its adherents. These were rather unusual words for a Swede. His intention was not so much to put his own views forward, but as to pass on a warning to Adolf Eichmann that he would do well to stop the deportation and extermination of Hungarian Jews. Eichmann could scarcely contain his amazement that anyone should dare ask him to attack him and criticize the Führer. But soon he realized he was getting the worst of the argument. His propaganda phrases sounded hollow compared to Raoul's intelligent reasoning. Look how close the Bolsheviks are. The war is almost over. Nazism is finished, and so are those who cling to it. It's the end of the Nazis and Hitler. Finally, Eichmann said, I admit that you're right, Herr Wallenberg. I've never believed in Nazism as such, but it has given me wealth and power, and I know that this pleasant life of mine will be over soon. My planes will no longer bring me women and wine from Paris. My horses and dogs, my luxurious quarters here in Budapest will soon be taken over by the Russians, and I myself, as an SS officer, will be shot on the spot. For me, there's no escape. But if I obey my orders from Berlin and exercise my power harshly enough, I may prolong my respite for some time. Wallenberg, why don't you call off your people? Why not leave now while you have the chance? Eichmann was beginning to lose his temper. Budapest will be held as though it were Berlin. With that, Eichmann got up to leave. I want to thank you for an exceptionally charming and interesting evening. We're not friends, he said to Wallenberg. He said, your diplomatic passport will not help you if I find it necessary to have you removed. Accidents do happen, even to a neutral diplomat. With these words, Eichmann stood to leave, not displaying any anger. With the imperturbable politeness of a well-educated German, he bade farewell to Raoul and thanked us for a particularly pleasant evening. To me, evil meeting good. I just felt that that's worthy of your attention. When the Holocaust ended, many of us tuned in to genocide. That's my daughter. Many of us tuned into genocide around Rwanda. But it's important to say that the Igbo lost hundreds of thousands. Equatorial Guinea lost hundreds of thousands. Bangladesh, over 250,000 young girls and women were raped during the independence movement in Bangladesh when Pakistan's General Khan brutally put down the independence movement. And up to 3 million Bangladeshis perished. We hardly hear of this. In 1965, in Indonesia, which was an ally with the United States, the communists were targeted by Suharto. Sorry, I have to do that. Almost 2 million died in '65. In Cambodia, in 1975 to 1979, a group takes over called the Khmer Rouge. This Khmer Rouge has this concept that Mao Zedong did not go far enough in his Peasants' Revolution, that he needed to really start at year zero. Well, how do you start at year zero? You empty the cities down to no one. Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, had less than 10,000 people by the time they finished the evacuations. This is an anti-urban, anti-intellectual, anti-famine revolution. Of the 7 million plus Cambodians, almost 3 million perish. A friend of mine that went to Cambodia recently said they are still a nation that is depressed over the loss. Families turned on families. The destruction is insurmountable. Something I wanted to mention was, if you ever get a chance, go on YouTube and put Confessions of Pol Pot. Without batting an eye, he looks at the camera and says, we were young, we made mistakes, we were far too young. If we could do it again, we'd do it differently. It's like that ethic that you and I take for granted. The ethic that says, if the person you just met tonight knocked on your door in the middle of the night because something was happening and their family was in jeopardy, you'd open the door and let them in and protect them. That ethic is completely missing in some people. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, Christmas Day. In 91, everybody knew that Yugoslavia was going to break up. It seemed that Slobodan Milosevic and a few did not get the memo, but in 91, 92, the Vance Owens, Owen Stoltenberg, Contact Group, and several other negotiations attempting to redraw the map of Yugoslavia. These near misses were so excruciatingly close, or could have been so excruciatingly close to the solution on several occasions. I knew participants in some of those conferences. In fact, the map of Srpska in Bosnia and the way that it works out, today, with the exception of Banja Luka, is primarily the way that the census was in the last census taken in Yugoslavia. This is a needless war. It's something that, had we gotten ahead of the game, those 8,300 Bosnians taken away from the UN, the 400 UN observers, handed over by the UN observers to their massacre at the hands of Ratko Mladic, would not have happened. Would not have happened. Kosovo. In Kosovo, at least we learn the lesson of Rwanda. In Kosovo, at least we use the satellite imagery not to obfuscate, but to say, oh, holy cow, these are actual mass graves. And Madeleine Albright recommended to the president got NATO involved, and we got on the right side of that. But I want to tell you a story about a young lady in Kosovo. My wife and I know Aisha Plana. She was a student of mine when she was 21, 22. She's down at the University of South Florida. She's 23 now. When she was 8 or 9 years old, her father and her family were asleep in their beds, and she heard screaming. They lived in this town. It was one of the first towns to be massacred, and they lived on a lake near the mountains. And so the sound would travel, and you couldn't quite tell what the sound was. So she woke up in the middle of the night. She went to her mom. She goes, "Mom, I hear screaming." She goes, "Oh no, that's just Serbian troops that are being rowdy and drinking." The next morning, when they were being evacuated, they stepped over the bodies of the dead people that were her compatriots that were massacred in Kosovo, in this town. They went to a friend's place out of town, and they slept and lived in the basement of their house for 6 months. Never seeing the light of day, only coming out occasionally at night. Unfortunately, they're omnivorous readers. They're huge readers. And the father was a professor. 3 daughters and the wife. One morning, somebody knocks on their door and says, they're going house to house, they're checking attics and basements. You've got to go now. Now, they've been debating what to do. Do you take a headlong run and try to get to the Macedon border, where you're going to have to go through the Serbian militias anyhow, with 3 young girls? Are you going to try something else? So they thought outside of the box, and they went back to their house, which had been evacuated. Nobody had been there. They're 3 blocks away from their house. This is almost going to work. They're passing through this one park in the open field. They need to get to the street, and then 2 blocks beyond that, when a Yugo putters by, stops, comes back, 4 big guys, I don't know how you get 4 big guys in a Yugo, come out with Kalashnikovs. Come right across the field, stop. The father is making a big show of, oh, maybe I've lost my paperwork. The wife is playing along, saying, oh, he always forgets it. It's probably back at the house. They're trying to jolly them along when Aisha blanches. White panics. She knows that they're close to being killed. She's 8 years old. She runs, and the gig is up. And they said, stop her. Then they load the guns. They stop her, and so her sister grabs her, takes her down, and they start praying. This is it. There is no silver lining here. One of the 4 troops comes out and says, Professor Plana, he had failed this young man. And then he took him into his kitchen after he failed him, and he tutored him every night for a semester, and then the young man passed. He said, no, that's fine. They're fine. Where are you going? You're going back to your house? He goes, sure. Here, I'll walk them. I'll be back in a few. He walks them back to their house. He says, do not, under any circumstances, come out. And that's how they survived. That in my classes, we would have Holocaust survivors, 80, 78 years of age, come in and share it. And originally my familiarity came from my family, but secondhand stories, thirdhand stories. Then you would have a person that was a young person during the Holocaust, now old and weather-worn, telling the story. Here you have a 22-year-old young lady, vivacious, just really likable. This is still going on our watch. On the cover is a young Syrian girl. She's dead. She's dead. That was a massacre. In 2001, during the summer, we got a bunch of interns in that were fantastic. Joanne and Yevgeny preferred to be called Eugene. They came to me and they said, we are interested in South Sudan, but we want to concentrate on Nuba. I said, okay, why? I said, well, there's something happening in Nuba and we don't know what it is. Nobody can get anything out. She said, okay. So we let them, go about they made some mistakes. But within 2 weeks, they had taken $350 worth of, I'll go off speaker for a second. They took $350 worth of these maps and they sent them to the bush pilots at Samaritan's Purse and Christian Solidarity Worldwide. The only people that were gung-ho enough to go in while the government was trying to shoot planes down. And the pilots, every time they get back to Nairobi, they would email us and say, the government shot at our plane, they destroyed these grain silos, they killed this many chicken and cows. And I looked at my staff and I said, why are they telling us about chickens? And because they thought I was an idiot, they said, because it's man-induced famine. Man-induced famine. If you can show that it's a man-induced famine, maybe something can happen. So we went to USAID, Roger Winters, and he said, we can't get anything out of Nuba. How are you doing? Oh, it's just $350 worth of maps. Now, they weren't prepared to do a drop at that time because it wasn't the season that they normally do. But with a man-induced famine, we worked up numbers, and then they confirmed the numbers that it was 30,000 people were in jeopardy. They did a lift for 30,000 people. 500 did starve. We thought that was a success until a year later, Akila, a friend of the center, you might remember Akila, he was like 6'6". You'd have to bend every time you come through the door, and his legs would take up my whole office. We were talking, and he was a little depressed. He wasn't usually a depressive guy. And I said, what's going on? He goes, well, my grandfather, it's the anniversary when he died. I said, oh, my dad died a year ago too. Was it cancer? And he goes, no, he died in the famine. You think 500 is a reasonable number until that's somebody sitting across from you. On December 2nd, 2001, the center had been founded and open for a year. I had done a master's thesis, which at the end of my master's thesis, I, like Greg, determined that this is preventable, but people need to get going, need to start doing something. So we opened a center, I sold a couple classic cars I had, and on December 2nd, almost a year later, we got an email that said, help us, we're being massacred. This had just been a theory. It was just an idea. It was just, if we reached out to places that bad news is happening, do you think anyone would call us, email us? Do you think we could confirm it? So it was Pastor Snyder, who ultimately died. He died of a non-related disease in Indonesia. Pastor Snyder, a human rights guy, and a third person had emailed us that the town of Poso had been massacred, or part of it had been massacred. And now there were 45,000 Christians holed up in Tantana, and Lasker Jihad warriors had surrounded it. Lasker Jihad warriors were upset because Christians in Moluccas had killed 500 Muslims 3 years before. Nonetheless. So I called up, well, before I called anyone, I was absolutely stunned. It was 1:45 in the morning. I had left this bar, which was across the street from the center. I would do my paperwork in the bar till about 1, then I'd go home. You know the place. And then I checked my message to make sure nothing's going on. So 1:45 I get the message, and honestly I don't know what to do. So I went to the sign that said, in case of genocide, break glass. I took it down, and the instructions are for 10, 15 people. So I woke up Mark Thornburg, and I woke up John Hagrick, just left this. And I said, first thing we need to do is we need to confirm it. If it's something that everybody has, if Reuters has it, AP has it, then we can now try to get to policymakers. But if nobody has it, then we have something very, very precious. We have the first word in the world of a genocide. We can confirm that. Maybe we can do something about it. Well, it turned out nobody had anything. Reuters, AP, none of the local stuff, nothing in Australia. So we had to confirm it. So I called up the American Embassy in Jakarta. First political officer was out, second, third, etc., and so forth. You remember those phone cards you used to use for long-distance calls? So I burned through one phone card. I only had 3. Second one, I finally talked to the operator at the embassy, and I said, Mary, I said, this is the most important phone call you're going to take this month. We think there's a massacre happening in Sulawesi. Can you get me somebody who would know? She goes, oh my, she's a little old lady. Oh my, this is important. I said, okay. So she gets me to the Counselor General on Surabaya, Robert Pollock. And I missed him, okay, at the end of the second card. Third card, I just get him as he's walking out the door. He goes, originally we thought it was 90,000. He goes, no, it's not 90,000. 45,000 Christians trapped in Tantana. I said, we have 800 to 2,000 Lasker Jihad warriors. He said, yeah, that's as good as anyone's guess. You know, do you confirm it? Yeah, it's absolutely happening. I got to leave here to write through. Click, phone went, phone card died. We had our confirmation. Now who do you give it to? So I called John Heidenreich again. I said, you got to tell me, who do we give it to and who do we target tomorrow morning? He says, okay. He was newly married. He says, I'll tell you, but you got to promise this is the last phone call because we're going to get a divorce. No, he was game. So he tells me the Australians, and we gave it to the Australians. Every print media, every newspaper, every TV station, every radio. It was ABC of Australia, Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the radio station that broke the story. Reuters and AP picked it using our text. So now, when we headed to Capitol Hill with John's strategy the next morning, he said, if you have Christians being massacred in a country that's about to get $120 million worth of US hardware, go to the Appropriations Committee and find a strongly Bible Belt conservative that can pick up the phone without batting an eye, get W or Cheney or Powell on the phone and ask them to call Megawati. Because Megawati, she's the daughter of Sukarno. Her hand with the generals was not that strong. She's a human rights, oriented president, but, whether the generals are truly going to listen to her. But if she has a strong hand and she says, listen, we might not get that American aid, that really gives her a strong hand to use with her generals. So we got to Cass Ballinger, and he kept pushing the report across the table, and he very folksy. Cass Ballinger is not the poster child for racial sensitivity. This congressman was the one with the black lawn jockey that got into trouble. You may remember that. So he said, well, Mr. O'Brien, that's real interesting, but I'm going to get you Cynthia McKinney and Tom Lantos. Those liberals love this stuff. So I said to him, we're not here to see the liberals. We're here to see you. You get a lot of money from the Christian Coalition. There are a lot of Christian people in your district that would care that you cared enough to stop Christians from getting killed. Now what about it, Congressman? Are you going to do the right thing? And he looked at me and he says, well, where is this place again? What do I say? What do I say? Now, we don't know. We don't know if Cass Ballinger called. All we know is that 48 hours later, for the first time in modern Indonesian history, Megawati sent 4,000 troops and broke the massacre up. A year later, Umar Thalib was arrested. Sulawesi, the man-induced famine, the Bukavu and Bunia massacres in eastern DR Congo, when people were being massacred on the ground, we had several contacts, but the one that we used the most in that area was the UNHCR, High Commission for Human Rights person that was on the ground. When we gave the information to the UN, HCHR, it's now called the OCHR, but I call it the old acronym. When we gave it to them, they said, this is really unusual timing. I said, why? So because the French mandate to go in, we're going to be working out the language on Monday. And this gives us a stronger mandate to use force in the French mandate. Do you understand? Before they're writing the mandates for I think it was the Uruguayan troops that were on the ground, which was saying, yes, stay and observe and don't have any arms in your gun, don't have any ammunition in your guns. So now with the French on the ground going in soon to break up the massacres in Bunia, Bukavu, between the Hima and the Lendu and a lot of the militias that were there, with that going on, they needed the ability to use their guns. And so having that timely human rights reporting made a difference in that case as well. When they asked us, where did you get this information from? We said, your guy on the ground. They said, well, why hasn't the guy on the ground called us? The guy in Bukavu was running for his life, and the guy in Kinshasa was going to bed. That report wasn't going to be written for a few days. So early warning does help. Another positive in early warning is, you may remember in Gujarat in 2002. Do you remember that trainload of Hindu pilgrims that were killed at Godhra? 57 of them died, and it was upgraded to 58 of them died in a firebombing. And at first it was believed that it was Muslims. A commission later on came out and said there is no possible way that somebody came in. This had to be something mechanical. Well, the result was, for some reason, the Hindu Nationalist Party that was local to Gujarat already had lists of Muslims that were in the area. And they targeted, with these lists, 2,000, more than 2,000, but they killed 2,000 Muslims in Gujarat. They killed the 2,000 Muslims, including a congressman. And what did the government do? This democracy then dispatched hundreds and hundreds of Sikh police officers, neutral, neutral police officers, in a conflict prevention, genius stroke, to get in between the Muslims and the Hindus and be an active presence at every major event where there could be violence. That's a success story. Nobody reads about it, nobody talks about it. It's not sexy, but that's how genocide prevention occurs. Today we have DR Congo, the rape capital of the world. We have trouble back in Nuba and in Darfur, with still massive displacement in Darfur and difficult situation back in Nuba since 2011, since the SPLA and the government have renewed their fighting there. In Nigeria, we have Boko Haram that is killing Christians throughout the north and the middle country. Obviously, we have many people dying in Syria, and North Korea remains a disaster. The center is part of the answer, and places like it. The U.S. Holocaust Museum is also part of the solution. The U.S. Holocaust Museum put out a report. If you ever get a chance, look at their blueprint for genocide prevention. The U.S. Holocaust Museum said, first of all, we need to do early warning. We need to look at rapid response. We need to have somebody in the NSC that can streamline and talk to the administration about making genocide prevention and watching these countries a priority. And then put that throughout the government. Well, Samantha Power, the famed author who is now the U.S. ambassador to the UN, was that representative at the NSC. And now with her at the UN, it makes a significant difference. You have somebody that believes in genocide prevention right there. Ambassador McDonald from the Institute for Multi-Track Diplomacy, and let's talk about that for a split second. So SCAR is a great starting place. Genocide Watch, the Center for the Prevention of Genocide and organizations like it, but the Institute for Multi-Track Diplomacy, you all know what Track 1 diplomacy is. It's when a state meets another state, when the head of state or their foreign minister. Ambassador McDonald Louise Diamond said, not only is there citizen diplomacy, Track 2, but there's trained professionals that should do diplomacy. There's educational diplomacy. There's business-to-business diplomacy. There's nonprofit diplomacy. There are at least 12 that they've identified, and those types of diplomacy build the meshing of the peace process. The Hail Mary diplomacy that we use today, where President Carter was fantastic at. In 1978, he hit a Hail Mary pass, a 90-yard pass, into the end zone when he got Sadat and Begin. And that's the gold standard of diplomacy. A friend of mine said, we're using 18th century diplomacy in the 21st century, when we've got all these means at our disposal. That same friend of mine said, you know, the United States foreign policy, we have a lot of bottom lines. Fighting terror, you know, protecting American trade interests, you know, watching our budget. There's a whole bunch of bottom lines, but the sanctity of human life is not even close to being in the top 50. Non-American human life. And that has to change. That changes with people like you and I. Ambassador McDonald came up with this idea from IMTD. He said, you know, a good way to stop the UN Security Council having so much trouble doing something about genocide is to empower the UN General Assembly to do something about it. And what he recommended was an amendment to the Genocide Convention, which would essentially make another approach to combating genocide. It wouldn't just leave it in the UN Security Council hands. And I know that Greg Stanton is going to work with some organizations to try to get that in front of various UN members and try to get UN members to support it. Perhaps we can talk at some point with the ambassador from Kosovo about that. It's a terrific idea. Building civic associations, internalizing you know, this commitment. You know, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, and the EU. These countries and that federation, pseudo-federation, they all have a commitment in writing in their national agenda for foreign policy to protect human life and a commitment to human rights. Okay? That's part of who they are, and they want the world to know it. They back it up with funding, and they back it up with missions. That's something that each of us as individuals, our nation, and the international community should do. Today, what I'm talking to you about is I'm calling on you. Most of you are practitioners, some of you are not. It's a clarion call to arms. It's a clarion call to arms that we cannot wait until the next Kosovo, the next Bosnia, the next Rwanda, the next Cambodia, the next Armenia, the next Holocaust, the next Ukraine, the next anything. We have to put those measures in place for early warning, rapid response now. I have one question for you before I open it up for questions. And my question is, Richard Rubenstein pulled me aside and he said, Richard, you should not name your book, what is the name of my book? The Most Dangerous Century, Genocidal Indifference from 1915 to 2014. He says, you should name your book, In Case of Genocide, Break Glass. Now, I just would like a quick show of hands. My title currently, if you like that more, this is important to me because I don't know what to title the thing, is called, what is it called?
I think that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. It's called, I'm sorry, it's just a long lecture here. It's called The Most Dangerous Century, Genocidal Indifference from 1915 to 2014. Raise your hand if you like that title. 7, 8. Okay. If you like In Case of Genocide, Break Glass, raise your hand. Okay, almost double that. Now, those that had your hand up, the criticism is that that title trivializes genocide. Anyone? Sir?
Yeah, I think people don't want to read the question stuff. They will skip this abstracts, and people will get drawn into the form.
The break glass?
Absolutely. As somebody who's been 11 years in the private sector, know a little bit about marketing, I would recommend you go for that. Otherwise, people just look and say no.
Okay. All right, I think I may have a decision to make there. Folks, it is not the happiest of lectures, but that is a little bit about the Center for the Prevention of Genocide. It's a little bit about 100 years of genocide, and a little bit about the preventive norms that we can undertake. The responsibility to protect is something that we've been talking a lot about in international circles, and it's something that all of us should play a role in voicing. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Have a great night, and I hope you buy the book when it comes out.